It was a quiet afternoon in a small town, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names and the sound of a car pulling up at the gas station was enough to make heads turn. On that day, Sergeant Marcus Johnson pulled in, wearing his Army uniform neatly pressed, the badges shining proudly on his chest. He had just come back from a long stretch of duty, and all he wanted was to fuel up his truck, grab a cold drink, and make his way home to his family. His wife had been waiting for weeks, and his little daughter had drawn a sign that said, "Welcome home, Daddy." It was supposed to be a happy day. Marcus carried himself with quiet dignity. He was tall, with a strong build from years of training, but his face was kind, and his eyes held stories of places most people in that little town would never see. Some noticed him and gave respectful nods. A few smiled, whispering to each other about how impressive he looked in his uniform. To many, he was a hero returning home. But not everyone saw him that way. On the other side of the street, a patrol car slowly rolled by. Inside was Officer Raymond Miller, a man known for his sharp temper and his habit of questioning people who didn't look like they belonged. He had been in the force for years, but instead of learning wisdom with age, he had become more suspicious, more rigid in his views. When his eyes caught Marcus at the gas pump, his face tightened. He slowed his car and pulled in, parking a little too close, his presence heavy and unwelcoming. Marcus noticed the patrol car but kept calm. He had faced worse situations overseas and knew that sometimes the best response was silence. He finished filling his tank, capped it, and reached for his wallet. That's when Officer Miller stepped out of his car and walked over. "Hey you," the officer called out, his voice sharp, almost like a command. "What are you doing here?" Marcus turned, standing tall, and spoke in a respectful tone. "Just getting some gas, sir. On my way home." The officer's eyes scanned Marcus up and down, not with admiration, but with doubt. He saw the uniform, but instead of respect, his mind filled with suspicion. "Let me see some ID," Miller demanded. Marcus reached calmly into his pocket and handed over his driver's license along with his military ID. "Here you go. Sergeant Marcus Johnson, United States Army." A few people nearby had started paying attention. Some looked confused. Why was a man in uniform being questioned like this? A couple whispered quietly, pulling out their phones just in case. The officer glanced at the IDs but didn't hand them back right away. "Army, huh?" he said slowly, as if he didn't quite believe it. "And what are you really doing here?" Marcus took a deep breath, trying to stay patient. "Sir, I just told you. I'm heading home after duty. My family lives 20 minutes from here. That's all." But Officer Miller wasn't satisfied. He began asking questions that made no sense. Where Marcus had been earlier in the day, why he chose this gas station, what he was carrying in his truck. His tone grew sharper with every word, while Marcus kept his voice steady, choosing respect over argument. By now, a small crowd had gathered at a distance. A young man whispered, "That's an Army sergeant. Why is he bothering him?" Another replied quietly, "Because he thinks he can." The air felt heavy, like a storm about to break. Marcus thought about his wife and daughter waiting for him at home. He thought about how proud his mother had been when he first wore this uniform, how she told him, "When people see you in that, they'll know you serve the country." He never imagined a moment like this, standing in his own homeland, questioned as if he didn't belong. The officer leaned closer. "Pop your trunk. I need to see what you're carrying." Marcus hesitated. He knew his rights. He also knew that resisting could make the situation worse, no matter how wrong it was. He spoke firmly but respectfully. "Sir, with respect, I don't believe you have reason to ask that." The officer's face turned red, his hand resting on his belt, close to his holster. "Are you refusing to follow my order?" The crowd gasped softly. Phones were raised higher now. Some recorded openly. Others pretended, not wanting to draw attention to themselves. Everyone could feel the tension rising, as if one wrong word could set the situation ablaze. Marcus raised his hand slightly, not in surrender, but as a sign of calm. "Officer, I'm not here to cause trouble. I've served my country honorably. I'm just trying to get home." His voice carried a mix of strength and quiet pain. In that moment, the silence was louder than words. The officer stared at Marcus, his mind clouded not by facts but by prejudice. The uniform that should have commanded respect seemed invisible to him. What he saw was not a decorated soldier, but only what his own bias allowed him to see. A little girl standing near the store tugged at her mother's sleeve and asked softly, "Mommy, why is the policeman being mean to the soldier?" The mother didn't answer. her eyes fixed on the scene with worry. Marcus felt the weight of every eye on him. He thought about the battles he had fought overseas, the times he had risked his life not just for people who looked like him, but for everyone. And yet, here he was, questioned at a gas station like he was a criminal. He stood tall, silent, his honor unshaken even as the officer's voice grew sharper. No one in the crowd could have predicted what would happen next. Some prayed quietly that reason would return to the officer, that he would see the truth in front of him. But Marcus knew better. He had seen this kind of moment before in faraway lands, when misunderstanding could spiral into something irreversible. He steadied himself, his mind whispering the words his father once told him. "Stand with dignity, son. Even if the world tries to take it away, never let them break your spirit." The gas station, usually a place of quick stops and small talk, had turned into a stage of tension. People held their breath, waiting for the next move. Marcus stood there calm and proud, while the officer shifted uneasily, his hand still near his holster. The world seemed to pause, caught in that fragile space between peace and chaos. And that was how it began. The moment that would change not just Marcus's life, but the life of an entire town. The silence around the gas station hung heavy as if the world had slowed down. Marcus stood calm, his eyes steady, even as the officer's hand hovered near his holster. The crowd watched nervously, whispers filling the air. Everyone hoped the situation would cool down, but then in a split second everything changed. The officer made a sudden move. His voice was sharp, almost trembling with his own tension. "Don't you dare refuse me again," he barked. Without giving Marcus a real chance to respond, he reached for his weapon. A sound cracked through the still air, a sound that made every heart skip a beat. Marcus staggered, his knees buckling as he fell to the ground. Shock spread like a wave. A woman screamed. Someone dropped their grocery bag and phones trembled in the hands of those recording. For a moment, time froze. People couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. A man in uniform, a decorated soldier, had been shot in his own homeland while standing peacefully. Marcus's hand pressed against his side where blood began to stain his uniform. His face twisted in pain, but his eyes, those steady eyes, remained calm. Gasps and shouts filled the air. "He shot him! He shot the soldier!" a young man yelled, his voice breaking with disbelief. "Call an ambulance!" another shouted. Several people rushed forward, but the officer raised his hand, shouting, "Stay back! Stay back!" But this time no one listened to him. An older woman, her hands shaking, knelt beside Marcus. "Stay with us, son," she whispered, pressing a scarf against his wound to slow the bleeding. Her kindness broke through the chaos while others called 911, their voices filled with urgency. Marcus, though in pain, spoke faintly. "Tell my wife, I'm coming home. Just a little late." The woman's eyes welled with tears. "You hold on, soldier. Help is coming," she said firmly, refusing to let him slip away. The officer, realizing the weight of what he had done, stepped back, his face pale. He resisted, he muttered as if trying to convince himself. But the crowd wasn't buying it. Dozens of phones were still recording, capturing every second, every word. Paramedics arrived within minutes, rushing with their equipment. They worked quickly, stabilizing Marcus, checking his pulse, and loading him onto a stretcher. The people stepped aside, some crying, others clapping softly as if to encourage him to fight. His uniform, now stained with blood, looked heavier than ever. As the ambulance sped away, the whispers began. "That man's in the army," someone said. "Did you see his ID?" "He's a sergeant," another confirmed. "They shot a soldier. This is going to explode," a man muttered, shaking his head. Inside the ambulance, Marcus drifted in and out of consciousness. His military ID had already been scanned by the paramedics system, triggering an alert. This wasn't just any patient. They realized this was a decorated soldier, someone under federal protection protocols. Within minutes, the Pentagon's emergency response system lit up, notifying his commanding officers. Back at the gas station, the officer tried to explain his actions, but his words only deepened the anger. "He didn't listen to my orders," he insisted. But the people who had been there, who had seen Marcus's calm composure, shook their heads. "He didn't have to," one man said. "He was respectful. He showed his ID. You shot him because you could." At the local police station, the atmosphere grew tense. Calls flooded in from reporters, from community leaders, from activists demanding answers. The chief of police rubbed his forehead, already sensing that this incident was beyond their control. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he muttered under his breath, staring at the officer. Meanwhile, far away in Washington, D.C., a phone rang in a secure office. A high-ranking general picked it up, listened carefully, and immediately stood up. "One of ours has been shot," he said grimly. Within moments, an entire chain of command was activated. Generals, Pentagon officials, and military police began preparing to move. The news traveled fast. Across military bases, whispers spread like wildfire. "Sergeant Johnson was shot back home," someone said in a mess hall. Soldiers froze mid-bite, their jaws tightening. To them, Marcus wasn't just another name. He was a respected comrade, someone who had served with honor. And now he had been attacked on his own soil. Back in the hospital, Marcus's wife, Lisa, rushed through the doors, her face pale with fear. She clutched her daughter's hand, who cried, "Where's Daddy?" Nurses guided them gently, telling Lisa that her husband was alive but in serious condition. She held her daughter tightly, whispering, "Daddy's strong. He'll be okay." But her own tears betrayed the fear in her heart. Reporters began gathering outside the hospital, their microphones ready. News vans parked in rows, their satellite dishes pointed to the sky. The story had already made headlines. Army sergeant shot by local officer. Pictures of Marcus in his uniform appeared on every screen, his smile bright, his eyes proud. At the Pentagon, a room filled with generals and senior officials studied the reports. They reviewed Marcus's record: years of service, medals of honor, missions completed with courage. This was not just any soldier. This was a man who had risked his life for his country, and now his country owed him justice. A decision was made quickly. "Deploy a response team," one general ordered. "Take federal warrants. Secure the town. We'll handle this directly." Black SUVs were prepared, documents signed, and within the hour a convoy of vehicles left Washington, heading straight for the small town where everything had unfolded. Back in the town, the people buzzed with nervous energy. The officer sat in the station, shifting uncomfortably as his colleagues avoided his gaze. The chief stared at the phone, which rang nonstop. "This isn't just local anymore," he muttered. "This is about to get federal." And so, while Marcus lay in the hospital, fighting to recover, a storm was already moving toward the town. Not just a storm of news and outrage, but a storm of authority. The kind that came from the highest levels of power in the country. No one in that small station could imagine the sight that was about to arrive. Pentagon generals stepping out of black vehicles, holding sealed warrants that would turn the tables completely. But at that moment, all anyone could think about was the man in the hospital bed, fighting for his life, and the question that lingered heavy in the air: how could this happen to a soldier who had given so much? The hospital room was filled with the steady beeping of machines. Sergeant Marcus Johnson lay on the bed, his uniform cut away so the doctors could treat his wound. His breathing was shallow, but his heartbeat was strong. Nurses moved around quickly, checking his vitals, replacing IV bags, and making sure he remained stable. His wife Lisa sat nearby, holding his hand, whispering words of comfort that only he could hear. Their daughter sat on her lap, clinging tightly to her mother's arm, her eyes wide with fear but refusing to let go. Doctors assured Lisa that Marcus was a fighter. "He lost a lot of blood," one doctor explained gently, "but he's stable now. He has the strength to pull through. What he needs most is rest." Lisa nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks as she kissed her husband's forehead. "You're strong, Marcus. You've come back from worse. You'll come back from this too." Outside the hospital, the crowd grew larger. Reporters stood with cameras, broadcasting updates by the minute. Soldiers from Marcus's base had already arrived, standing guard in their uniforms, a silent show of support for their brother in arms. Some saluted as they entered the hospital, their eyes heavy with both respect and anger. To them, this wasn't just a crime against a man. It was a crime against their entire family, the family of those who serve. Back at the small-town police station, the mood was uneasy. The officer who shot Marcus sat in a chair, his head lowered, trying to piece together a story that would protect him. He resisted, he kept saying to anyone who would listen. He refused my order. He was acting suspicious. But his words carried no weight now. Too many witnesses had seen what really happened. Too many phones had captured the truth. The chief of police paced the office, frustration etched across his face. "Do you realize who you shot?" he asked sharply. "That man is a decorated Army sergeant. This isn't just another case. Washington is already watching." Phones rang without stopping. Reporters demanded statements. Community leaders wanted answers. Civil rights attorneys began arriving, promising justice. The chief knew this was no longer in his hands. The moment the Army became involved, the matter had moved beyond the reach of local law enforcement. Meanwhile, in Washington, a convoy was already on the road. Inside sleek black SUVs sat high-ranking generals and federal agents. They spoke little, their faces set in grim determination. Each carried a folder filled with documents, warrants signed by federal judges authorizing them to investigate and take action. They knew what awaited them, a small-town police force unprepared for the storm that was coming. As the convoy sped down the highway, news outlets flashed images of Marcus across every screen. Photos of him in uniform, smiling with his daughter, standing proudly with his unit. Stories of his bravery spread quickly. Sergeant Johnson once pulled 2 injured soldiers to safety during a mission overseas, one reporter said. He has medals for valor, for service, for honor. And now he lies in a hospital bed after being shot in his own hometown. In living rooms across the nation, people shook their heads in disbelief. How could this happen? They asked. Strangers who had never met Marcus began sending prayers, letters, and even flowers to the hospital. Social media erupted with support for the Johnson family. Hashtags trended. Videos of the incident at the gas station spread like wildfire, showing the calm dignity of Marcus against the harsh, reckless actions of the officer. Inside the police station, fear grew. Officers who had once worked alongside the shooter now avoided his gaze. They knew the eyes of the country were on them. The chief received a call from a federal official. The message was short, sharp, and final. "We're coming. Prepare your department for inspection." The officer shifted nervously in his chair. "They can't do this. This is our jurisdiction," he said weakly, but the chief shook his head. "Not anymore. You crossed a line. When you shot a soldier, you didn't just shoot a man. You shot the Army." At the hospital, Marcus slowly opened his eyes. His vision was blurry, but he could make out the figures of his wife and daughter. Lisa leaned closer, her hand gripping his tightly. "You're safe now," she whispered. "Don't speak. Just rest." Marcus managed a faint smile, his lips barely moving. "Home," he whispered. "I want to go home." Tears rolled down Lisa's cheeks as she kissed his hand. "You will," she promised. "I'll make sure of it." Generals at the Pentagon received live updates from the convoy. "ET 30 minutes, one officer reported. Local police are nervous. The community is restless. We need to take control before this escalates further." The generals nodded. "When we arrive with authority. No one will stand in our way." In the town, word spread quickly that the military was coming. Some residents lined the streets waiting to see the powerful motorcade. Others whispered in disbelief. "I've never seen the Pentagon send generals into a small town," one man said. "This must be serious." The officer who had pulled the trigger now sat alone, his hands trembling. For the first time, he realized the weight of his actions. No excuse, no explanation, no story would save him from what was coming. His badge felt heavy in his pocket, but it no longer offered him the shield he thought it would. Back in the hospital, Marcus's fellow soldiers stood in the hallway. They saluted every time a doctor walked by, as if guarding their brother with honor. One of them, a young corporal, spoke softly to Lisa. "Ma'am, I served with your husband. He once saved my life. I'll never forget that. We won't let him down now." Lisa's eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "He needs all of you now." The hospital room felt like a sanctuary, filled with love, prayers, and hope. But outside, the town buzzed with tension. Reporters shouted questions. Protesters began gathering, holding signs calling for justice. The world was watching, and then from a distance, the low hum of engines grew louder. Black SUVs approached, their tinted windows gleaming under the afternoon sun. The convoy moved with precision, a symbol of authority and power. People stopped what they were doing, turning to watch as the vehicles rolled into town. Children pointed, adults whispered, and officers at the station froze when they saw what was coming. The sound of those engines carried a message. This was no longer a local matter. This was federal. This was the Pentagon stepping into their world. Inside the lead vehicle, a general looked out the window, his face stern. "We're here for justice," he said quietly. The others nodded. They carried not just warrants, but the weight of the United States military behind them. The small town, once quiet and ordinary, was now the center of a storm. The world's eyes were on it, and the line of black SUVs growing closer with every second promised that justice was on its way. The hum of engines grew louder as the convoy of black SUVs rolled into the town. Their windows were dark, their movement precise, and their presence carried a weight that silenced conversations along the streets. People stepped out of shops, paused in front of their houses, and lined the sidewalks, whispering in disbelief. No one in that small town had ever seen such a display of power, not from the military, not from anyone. Children clung to their parents' hands, pointing at the vehicles. "Who are they?" one boy asked. His father shook his head. "Those are generals, son. Real generals. The army doesn't send people like that unless something very serious has happened." The convoy stopped right in front of the police station. Doors opened in unison, and out stepped men and women in crisp uniforms and dark suits. Their shoes clicked against the pavement, their faces stern, their eyes sharp. Leading them was General Harris, a tall man with silver hair and a chest full of ribbons that spoke of decades of service. Beside him were two other generals and several federal agents. In their hands were sealed folders heavy with authority, federal warrants that gave them power far beyond the reach of any local badge. The crowd grew larger, drawn by curiosity and awe. Phones lifted into the air as people recorded every second. Some whispered prayers, others clapped softly, and a few simply stood in silence, realizing they were witnessing a moment that would be remembered for years. Inside the police station, the chief looked out the window and froze. He had expected some sort of investigation, maybe a call from Washington or a visit from federal agents. But generals walking into a small-town department, that was something he had never imagined. He turned to his officers. "Stand up straight," he ordered, his voice shaky. "This isn't just an inspection. This is the Pentagon." The officer who had pulled the trigger sat in the corner, his face pale. His hands trembled as he realized that the shield he thought he carried, the badge, the uniform, was about to be shattered by something far greater. "They can't just walk in here," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. But the fear in his eyes betrayed the truth. He knew they could. The front doors of the station swung open and silence fell. General Harris stepped inside, his presence commanding the room without a single word. His eyes swept across the station, pausing briefly on the officer before moving to the chief. He pulled a document from the folder and placed it on the desk. "We are here under direct orders from the Pentagon," he said firmly. "This station is now under federal investigation." The chief swallowed hard, his throat dry. He tried to speak but found no words. The general continued, his tone calm but unyielding. "We are in possession of federal warrants to seize evidence, review conduct, and take custody of the officer involved in the shooting of Sergeant Marcus Johnson." The room shifted. Officers glanced at each other nervously, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. For years they had operated within the boundaries of their small town, answering only to their own hierarchy. But now, with a single piece of paper, the balance of power had changed. General Harris turned his gaze directly to the officer. "Stand up," he commanded. His voice carried no anger, only authority, the kind of authority that comes from decades of leadership. The officer hesitated, his legs weak. "Do it now," another general said sharply. With trembling hands, the officer rose to his feet. Federal agents stepped forward, their movements swift and precise. They took hold of the officer, securing his hands as cameras outside flashed through the windows. The crowd erupted in murmurs as news spread instantly. The officer was being taken into federal custody. The chief tried to protest. "General, surely we can handle this internally." But General Harris cut him off. "With all respect, Chief, you cannot. A soldier of the United States Army was shot in your jurisdiction. This is not only a crime against a man. This is a matter of national security and military honor. The Army takes care of its own." The chief lowered his eyes, realizing the truth. There was nothing more he could say. The generals did not stop there. They handed over more documents, authorizing the search of the station. Agents began moving quickly, collecting reports, reviewing footage, securing evidence. The officers stood by helplessly, watching as their desks, once symbols of authority, became subjects of scrutiny. Every drawer opened, every file examined. It was clear that nothing would remain hidden. Outside, the crowd grew louder. Some cheered at the sight of justice unfolding. Others held signs calling for accountability. Reporters shouted questions as agents escorted the officer out of the station in handcuffs. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" one reporter asked. The officer kept his head down, his silence speaking louder than any words could. The sight of a local cop being taken away by Pentagon generals sent a shockwave through the town. People whispered to each other, "I've never seen anything like this. It's like a movie." Another replied, "No, this is real. This is justice." Inside the hospital, soldiers watching the news on a small television let out quiet cheers. One of them clenched his fist, saying, "That's for you, Sarge. They've got your back." Lisa, sitting by Marcus's side, smiled faintly when she saw the images. She kissed her husband's hand and whispered, "They came for you. You're not alone." General Harris addressed the press outside the station. His voice was steady, his words deliberate. "The United States Army does not turn its back on those who serve. Sergeant Marcus Johnson is one of ours, and when one of ours is harmed unjustly, we will pursue justice with every authority granted to us. This case will be handled at the highest level, and we will not rest until the truth is honored." The crowd erupted in applause, some with tears in their eyes. For many, it was the first time they had seen such power used not against them but for them. A sense of hope spread, stronger than fear, stronger than anger. As night fell, the police station remained under federal control. Agents worked late into the evening, carrying out boxes of evidence, sealing them in vehicles bound for Washington. The officer sat in a federal van, staring blankly ahead, the reality of his actions crashing down on him. Meanwhile, Marcus slept peacefully in his hospital bed, surrounded by family and fellow soldiers. His breathing steadied, his strength slowly returning. Though he did not yet know the full scale of what was happening outside, his spirit seemed lighter, as if some invisible burden had been lifted. The town, once quiet and ordinary, had become the center of a story that reached far beyond its borders. Across the nation, people tuned in, watching every update, every clip. They saw generals walking into a police station, warrants in hand, and they understood the message. Justice was not only possible, it was unstoppable when carried by the weight of truth. And in that small town, beneath the glow of streetlights and the hum of black SUVs still parked outside the station, the people felt a shift. It was not just about one man or one officer or even one town. It was about a nation remembering its promise that those who serve with honor will never stand alone. The morning sun rose gently over the hospital, casting a warm glow through the windows of Sergeant Marcus Johnson's room. For the first time since the terrible incident, his eyes opened with clarity. His breathing was steadier, his strength slowly returning, and when he saw his wife Lisa sitting by his side with their daughter asleep in her lap, a faint smile touched his lips. Lisa leaned forward quickly, tears of relief in her eyes. "Marcus," she whispered softly, brushing his hand with hers. "You're awake." He nodded weakly, his voice low but steady. "I told you. I'd come home." His words brought fresh tears to Lisa's face, but this time they were tears of joy. Their daughter stirred, rubbing her eyes, and when she saw her father awake, she climbed onto the bed and hugged him carefully. "Daddy, you're back," she said with a smile so pure it melted every heart in the room. Doctors checked his vitals and confirmed what everyone hoped. Marcus was on the road to recovery. The wound would take time to heal, but his spirit was unbroken. In fact, he seemed stronger, as if the trial had given him a new kind of resilience. News of his improvement spread quickly. Outside the hospital, crowds cheered when they heard he was awake. Soldiers saluted. Neighbors brought flowers, cards, and banners that read, "We stand with Sergeant Johnson." Messages of support poured in from across the country. Letters from school children, prayers from churches, and notes from fellow veterans who called him a brother. Meanwhile, the officer who had shot Marcus was now far from the comfort of his small-town station. He sat in a federal holding facility, awaiting charges that were far more serious than he had ever imagined. The warrants signed by Pentagon officials carried weight that even his lawyers could not contest. For the first time, he faced accountability not just in the eyes of his town, but in the eyes of the entire nation. Television screens across the country replayed the same images. the officer being led away in handcuffs, the generals walking into the station with authority, and Marcus's face on hospital monitors steady and dignified. Commentators spoke passionately about what the story represented. "This is bigger than one man," one anchor said. "This is about fairness, honor, and the promise that no one who serves this nation will ever stand alone." Back in town, life began to change. The gas station where everything began was now covered with flowers, flags, and handwritten notes taped to the walls. Strangers drove from other towns just to stand there quietly, as if honoring a sacred ground. Some left candles at night, creating a glow of remembrance and hope. Inside the hospital, Marcus began physical therapy. Each small step was difficult, but he faced it with determination. His wife and daughter were always by his side, encouraging him with every move. Soldiers from his unit visited daily, sharing stories that made him laugh, lifting his spirits with their loyalty and brotherhood. One of them told him, "You saved me overseas. Now we're all here to make sure you get through this too." Marcus nodded, humbled by the outpouring of love. The generals visited him as well. They stood at his bedside, saluted him, and thanked him for his service. General Harris spoke directly, his voice filled with respect. "Sergeant Johnson, your courage does not go unnoticed. What happened to you will not be forgotten. Justice is moving forward, and you have the gratitude of an entire nation." Marcus, though still weak, managed to lift his hand and return the salute, his pride shining through his pain. The officer's trial began weeks later, and the courtroom was packed. Witnesses testified about what they saw at the gas station. Video recordings played on large screens, showing Marcus's calm demeanor, his respectful responses, and the unnecessary escalation by the officer. The jury watched in silence, their faces solemn. Every detail revealed the truth. Marcus had been treated unfairly, and the officer's actions had no justification. The verdict was clear. The officer was found guilty on multiple charges and sentenced under federal law. The news spread quickly, and while justice could not erase the pain of the incident, it brought a sense of closure. People across the country saw the outcome as proof that accountability was possible, even against those who once thought they stood untouchable. Marcus, now walking with more strength each day, watched the news from his home. His family sat beside him, holding his hands. Lisa whispered, "It's over, Marcus." Justice was served. He nodded slowly, his heart heavy but grateful. "It's not just about me," he said quietly. "It's about everyone who deserves to be treated with dignity." The community, once divided, began to heal. People who had been silent before now spoke up, vowing to ensure such a thing would never happen again in their town. Schools invited Marcus to speak to children, and he told them stories not of anger but of hope, courage, and respect. His message was simple: stand tall, live with dignity, and always believe that truth will prevail. Months passed, and Marcus regained much of his strength. One evening, he stood on his porch looking out at the quiet street. His daughter ran around the yard laughing while Lisa prepared dinner inside. The world had changed for them, but in that moment he felt peace. He had survived not just the bullet but the storm that followed. He had endured the weight of injustice and lived to see the power of truth. The story of Sergeant Marcus Johnson became more than just news. It became a lesson, told in classrooms, spoken about in churches, and shared among soldiers across the world. His name became a symbol of resilience and honor. And though he never sought fame, his story carried a light that reached far beyond his small town. On the anniversary of his recovery, the town held a ceremony in his honor. Soldiers lined the streets, veterans saluted, and the mayor presented him with a medal of recognition for his bravery, both in service and in life. Marcus stood tall, his uniform once again pressed and proud, his wife and daughter by his side. The crowd clapped, some with tears in their eyes as he spoke softly into the microphone. "I did not choose this path," he said, his voice steady, "but I chose to stand with dignity. And I want every person here to know you are not alone. If you ever feel unseen, remember this: the truth will find its way and justice will stand with you." The applause that followed echoed through the town, carrying with it a sense of hope and unity. For Marcus, it was not about vengeance, but about healing, about reminding people that even in the darkest moments, light can break through. And so the story ended not with bitterness, but with a new beginning. A beginning where one man's courage reminded a nation of its promise. A beginning where a community learned to see each other not through the lens of suspicion, but with respect. A beginning where a little girl could look up at her father and say with pride, "That's my daddy. He's my hero."